Hey guys, this is Mr. V here doing a book review today for The Monk by Matthew Lewis. Just so you know, before I get into my book review, I try to do a spoiler-free book review. If I give any spoilers, they're just minor spoilers. So that's why if you see me looking down occasionally, I just have notes. So I try not to give any spoilers away. So, The Monk by Matthew Lewis. Before I talk about what I felt about The Monk, there's a few things I feel you should know for the book before you consider reading the book. The first thing is that this book was written or released in 1796. So that was almost 230 years ago. So the style of language was different. It's like an older style English. It's not that hard to understand, but just be aware of that. But even though it's a different type of language, human traits do not change. I've read many different type older books, and you can see through some of these older books, human traits basically stay the same. So you can even say, with the exception of the old style English, this could have been written just a little while ago, because again, the human traits do not change. Another thing you guys should know is that I feel this book is meant for adults. This book is meant for adults because of the topics discussed in here, and also that this is a very, very dark book. And that's why I feel this is meant for adults, that I would not recommend it for anyone under 18. Another thing is that religion is involved. It's a pretty, they involve it pretty heavily. I mean, look at the title of the book, The Monk, and it's about a monk. So religion is involved, so be aware of that. And I would say, this isn't a big opinion of mine, if you're very heavily into religion and heavily religious, I would not recommend the book, just because I don't think you would enjoy it. You know, maybe you would, but I think you would be somewhat angry in the book, because they talk about monks, they talk about nuns, they talk about everyday people. But just be aware of that, because there are very risky things said. I'm surprised that they could publish this in the 1790s, but even in today's day, you could say they're pretty risky things said. So, let's get into the book review for what I felt about The Monk by Matthew Lewis. So, The Monk is basically, it's a story about a guy named Ambrosio, and maybe I'm pronouncing his name wrong, but Ambrosio, he is a monk, and basically he is torn between his spiritual vows and the temptations for sexual things. And it just shows the internal battle amongst himself. And that is the main premise of the story. So, this is actually, there's a few things I want to say, but basically this is a dark love story. You could say this is multiple love stories, because there are 3 different love stories included in here, but this is a very dark love story. And you'll see a little bit more why if you read the book, but also in my book review. But this is a very dark love story, because some very dark things happen during the love story. But it still, in the end, is a love story. But also, you guys should know that there are very long chapters in the book. There's only, I think, 14 or 15 chapters in the book. So there are some pretty long chapters. Some of the chapters are like 80 pages. I don't remember the exact count. But like there are some pretty long, like 80, 100 page chapters. I think it's like 80 page chapters. So just be prepared to read some long chapters after you start, because the chapters do flow very smoothly. So it is hard to take a break in between. Like, you don't want to take a break. There are times you could, but after you start the chapter, you kind of want to finish it, because basically Matthew Lewis, he devotes a chapter to just one character. He doesn't like flip-flop between different characters. He devotes it to that one character. So that's why you don't really want to stop after you started the chapter. And it also flows smoothly, as I will get a little more in depth right now. But let's talk about the beginning of the book. So the beginning, I felt that it had a little bit of a tough beginning. It was a very tough beginning because, as I said, there weren't many chapters, but there are 3 different story plots that connect somewhat loosely in the beginning. They start to connect more throughout the book, but they connect loosely in the beginning. And there's 3, as I said, 3 different story plots. but that because different chapters go to different characters and there are very long chapters, again, I need to reiterate that, it's very long chapters, that it can be a tough beginning because while the long chapters help develop the character to where you get to know the character, because he will focus on like character A in one chapter and then go to character B in the next chapter, in the beginning, it is tough to remember different characters because it's not easy taking a long break from the character and his storyline and then coming back a couple chapters later or 2 chapters later and remembering, okay, what was that what was that character's internal struggle? But after you get the book going, you get to know who the characters are. I wouldn't say there's too many characters. There's a decent amount, but there's not that many characters. But in the beginning, it definitely is a tough beginning. So just be prepared to stick it out. Don't give up after just a few chapters. Be prepared. Just be prepared for that aspect. Because this story has a lot of emotion. Like it just has so much emotion, and you think about a lot of different things because they show the good in human, but they also show the very, very bad and evil in some humans. Because in here, I even wrote some of the things you see throughout the book is you see there is action, but you see the bad traits in people like love, anger, sadness, evilness, revenge, betrayal, deception, ego, how people become hypocrites, and how selfish people can become. And like an example, I don't want to go too much because I'll spoil something, but an example is like some people will condemn one person for doing something, yet they will do that exact same thing. So it shows how they are just a hypocrite, and they will condemn it, and then they will do that thing, and then they will condemn other people again for doing that. So it shows, and people are that way. I've seen many people who will condemn you for doing something, yet they do it. So, it just shows that, like, how humans act that way. And how humans, he shows in here that humans, how they will justify what they want. They will somehow, even if it's an absurd justification, they will justify what they want. And how they will even blame others for the bad things they have done, or basically their sins. How they will blame the others. They will say, yeah, it is your fault that I did this. Even though I committed the sin, it is your fault. And they will do that. Yet they will justify it. And it just shows the internal struggle that people go through. And again, I have seen this in people, and there's times where I've justified what I've wanted to do, so it's just people do this kind of stuff. And it's also kind of like this shows how much people will do to get what they want. But in this story, it obviously exemplifies it to about how evil people will become to get what they want. It is very, very crazy. And it shows in here. And it's sad to say that you've seen this in the news at different times about what people will do, how they will justify it, but how much evil they will do just to get what they want. So, it is definitely a tough book. But overall, it is definitely well written because he engages you. Even though there's long chapters, the author, Matthew Lewis, he just engages you in those chapters to where, like, the story flows very smoothly. Like, as I said, you don't want to put the book down because the story just flows smoothly from one chapter to another chapter. And there are stories within the stories in those chapters, yet I didn't feel like it was forced or bad. I've read books where there are stories within stories, and I'm like, that just did not fit. But this one, it just was, there were stories within stories, and it made sense, and it was really fun. It just made it better. It added to the drama. So it was really good. Now, while it does flow very smoothly, some parts are a little slow. I wouldn't say they drag. I do not say they drag, but they are a little slow. So, just give it time to flesh it out a bit. Because there are parts that will be a little slow, but what was really cool about the story is that you cannot guess what will happen. I could not guess what would happen, and you continue to wonder, which keeps you engaged. And even up until the very end of the book, I had no clue how this book was going to end, and I want to talk about that briefly. But it's just, you continue to wonder what will happen. And I thought it was very clever how he connected so many different storylines, like something would happen and it would seem random, but then later he would somehow connect it. And he just did a very cool and just clever way of connecting the stories. So, I give him a lot of credit for that. And also know that it becomes much more intense throughout the book. And it becomes much darker throughout the book. Don't think that, oh, I got through the first few chapters. It's not that dark. It becomes, at the very end, it can become very, very dark. I've said that many times, and I'm going to say it again before the very end. It just, be prepared for that. It can be very tough at times because it goes more throughout the book. And I also thought another great part about this book was that it had an amazing, amazing end. I was just in shock at the end. Like, it just leaves you shocked and makes you think about the rest of the book, like the whole book, but it just leaves you in shock. But then he kept building upon that shock. Like, you would be in shock for something that happened, and then he would add something else like leaves you in bigger shock, to where I just thought it was an amazing end. And the most important part about the end is that he basically answers everything. Like, what happens to the different characters, and that's always the most important part to me. So, I just thought that was really cool. Now, some of the negatives of the book, were the long chapters. I felt he could have broken up the chapters a bit. I thought that, I'm just giving an example of like 80 pages. Instead of making an 80-page chapter, he probably could have made it like, broken it up into 3 separate chapters. That way it would have made it a little easier to put the book down just for a bit. Again, it flows smoothly, but just, again, I thought that was kind of tough sometimes, that there's long chapters, because there were times you have to put the book down and it's just sometimes difficult to get right back into it. And I think he's a clever enough writer based off reading the book that he probably could have broken it up. And another part is that, again, that it was a tough beginning, because there were long gaps between the storylines, and it's a tough beginning because there's different characters, and because of the long gaps, you need to it takes a little time to get into the book, because you don't fully know who the characters are because of those long chapters. So, those were some of the tough aspects, or some of the negatives. But overall, I still thought this was a great book. Now, before I give my official review, again, just prepare. If you want to read this book, prepare for darkness, because this is not for the weak. This seriously is not for the weak, because this is very, very dark. And by the end, there are some of the material that he covers is very risky, and it's very dark. That this is the darkest book I have read. Now, maybe you could say, I don't read that many gothic type of books, but this is one of the darkest book, or the darkest book I've read. And I've read things online about other people. They feel the same, because he covers some incredibly sick topics. So that's why, just be prepared for that. Don't go into this lightly. But if you can handle some of those topics, this will be a great book. But again, do not take this book lightly. Do not go into it thinking, "Oh, I can handle it." I like some of the dark books, but this one was still incredibly dark. But if you can handle it, it will be a great book. So let me give you my official rating on this book. So I always rate my books on a scale of 0 to 10. A 0 is an awful book. I put a 5 as an average and a 10 as phenomenal. And if it gets to 10, that should really be your next book to read. Because a 5 is average, and I'm known to be a very tough critic, to where it's hard to move up even 0.5 in my rating system. So this was a very tough book to rate. I kept debating between 2 ratings, but I'm going to give my official rating for this book an 8.5, which in my rating system, that's very high. I almost rated it an 8, but I feel it deserved an 8.5. A lot of the book was about a 7.5. That I thought a lot of the stories, all that was really good, but that end bumped it up. Like the final end of like the last chapter and a half really bumped it up to the 8.5. I just thought that was again, it leaves you in shock, and I just thought that was what really bumps it up, because in the end, I reflected, it made me reflect on the whole book, and I reflected on the book, and that it actually teaches you multiple things in this book. And, and one of the main things is be careful who you trust. That's one of the main things. And there is one critical element, which I cannot expose, that it teaches you in the book. And that's towards the end. It teaches you one very critical element. But one of the other criticals is be careful who you trust. And overall, the book reminds you to be a better person. It kind of reminds you of that. I know it sounds silly to say that when it's like a dark book, but when you see some of the things that happen in the book, it reminds you to be a better person. And again, there's one very critical element that I cannot expose. But that is why I bumped it up to an 8.5, because it's, you know, there was just, it was great writing. The traits were, you know, it was just the traits of human. It shows the good and the bad. It was just, there were many things in it. But that's why, again, this is getting a very high rating. If you can handle very dark, again, it's very dark. If you can handle that, I recommend that you guys go and get this book and that you guys will enjoy the book. If you guys have any disagreements, you guys have any questions, you have anything, please post it in the comment section below. I hope you guys click the subscribe button, as I always do multiple different book reviews. Anyway, thank you for watching my book review for The Monk by Matthew Lewis. I hope you guys, this is Mr. V, I hope you guys go and enjoy your readings.